In the shadow of empire and under layers of lace, corsets, and perfectly folded napkins, the Victorian royals were weird. Not just eccentric, operatically bizarre. From tattooed princes to breakfast for ghosts, sugar sculptures to synchronized umbrellas, these were the crowned heads of history as you've never met them. Vulnerable, vain, obsessive, and oddly relatable. This isn't about power, it's about personality. And it's 53 stories long. Welcome to the Palace of the Peculiar, where the corsets are tight, the morals are tighter, and absolutely no one is normal. Before we dive in, don't forget to subscribe for more strange history, royal oddities, and stories too weird to make up. Also, let me know in the comments. Where in the world are you listening from? And what time is it right now? Midnight? Noon? Half asleep in bed or deep in a YouTube rabbit hole? I see you. Let's get into it. 1. Queen Victoria's chloroform births. In the year 1853, Queen Victoria lay in labor for the 8th time. The air inside Buckingham Palace was heavy with more than anticipation. It was dense with judgment, expectation, and the silent scrutiny of an empire that believed pain in childbirth was a woman's divine punishment. That is, until she broke tradition in a puff of sweet-smelling ether. Enter Dr. John Snow. Not the bastard from the wall, but the father of modern anesthesia. With a silk handkerchief and a precisely measured dose of chloroform, he delivered what Victoria would later call that blessed chloroform. A queen moaning into unconsciousness while the British medical establishment clutched its pearls. The church warned it was ungodly. Some physicians claimed it would destroy the maternal instinct. Others whispered, not so quietly, that it would lead to hysteria. Or worse, feminism. Victoria did not care. She did it again with baby number 9. Her public approval of chloroform didn't just ease her own suffering. It kicked off a trend among upper-class mothers who now had royal permission to pass out during delivery. Within a decade, the same doctors who had balked were branding the stuff as modern, safe, and even patriotic. Anesthetic sales surged. Pain, it seemed, could be optional, if you had the right connections. Of course, nobody offered it to the lower classes. Too expensive, too controversial, too much like cheating nature. But the Queen's bold breath of sweet oblivion sent a message. Even in a world obsessed with propriety, a woman could opt out of suffering, if she had the crown, the cash, and the courage. And yet, for all that radical gasping rebellion, Victoria would spend the rest of her life surrounded by death, memory, and silence. Which brings us to a different kind of birth plan, the one she wrote for her funeral. 2. A widow in white. When Queen Victoria died in 1901, she left behind 63 years of rule, 9 children, over 40 grandchildren, and a note. Not a will, not a speech, just a list. A private, curated request of objects, garments, and tokens to be placed in her coffin before the lid was closed for good. It was less like a royal burial and more like a sentimental time capsule, written by a woman who had spent 4 decades dressing for mourning. But in death, she wore white. Underneath the ceremonial black draped over the coffin, Victoria's body was shrouded in a white silk dress and her original wedding veil, a fraying net of lace that once symbolized romance and now whispered of ghosts. She asked to be buried with mementos no royal advisor approved. A lock of Prince Albert's hair, his dressing gown, a plaster cast of his hand. And tucked discreetly alongside them, John Brown's photograph, his pocket handkerchief, his mother's wedding ring. Brown, her Highland servant, the man some courtiers loathed, and others suspected of being far more than a companion. Even in death, Victoria was orchestrating narratives. The white gown, a rebuttal to the decades she spent as a walking monument to sorrow. The veil, a callback to the moment before everything went dark. And the hidden tokens, her last private rebellion against the machinery of monarchy, one final stubborn insistence that she was more than a symbol. No state procession could obscure the intimacy of those details. The public saw the pomp, the brass, the horse-drawn hearse. But inside the coffin was a woman who never stopped being a wife, a widow, a mother, and maybe, just maybe, a secret romantic. Yet for all her private sentiment, Victoria's grief wasn't performative. It was compulsive, devotional, which is why, even after Albert was gone, he still got breakfast. If you've made it this far, congrats, you're officially in too deep to turn back. Quick pause. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss the next royal rabbit hole we tumble into. And while we're at it, where are you tuning in from and what time is it on your end? Late night? Lunch break? Suspiciously long study session? Drop it in the comments. I'm watching. 3. Breakfast for the absent prince. Albert died in 1861. For most Victorians, the death of a spouse meant black crepe, social withdrawal, and maybe a melancholic poem. For Queen Victoria, it meant living the next 40 years as though Albert had simply stepped out of the room. Every morning, his shaving water was brought to his dressing room. His clothes were laid out on the bed. His chair remained at the dining table, untouched but sacred. Servants moved in practiced silence around his quarters, dusting, polishing, adjusting. They were serving a ghost, and they knew it. Victoria wasn't pretending he was alive. That would be madness. No, this was a ritual, a daily performance of memory, a theater of mourning so committed that it blurred into belief. Albert was not gone, merely elsewhere, in another room, on an eternal walk, just out of reach, but not out of relevance. The Queen's fixation unnerved her children. Ministers whispered concerns. One courtier wrote that the atmosphere in the royal household had become funereal, in perpetuity. But there was no moving on. Grief was not a phase. It was a place Victoria had chosen to live. In many ways, she made mourning fashionable. Black became a national color. Jewelers marketed jet jewelry as mourning chic. Etiquette books published precise rules for how long one must grieve, depending on your relationship to the deceased. And yet, no one matched the Queen's stamina. Her widowhood outlasted entire governments. But perhaps the strangest part wasn't her mourning. It was how the dead continued to receive royal privileges. Albert got breakfast. Albert got fresh linens. Albert got seasonal updates to his wardrobe. And if you think that's devoted, wait until you hear what she buried with his unofficial replacement. Because when it came to grief, Victoria didn't just play favorites, she kept souvenirs. 4. John Brown's keepsakes. John Brown was a Highland servant with muddy boots, blunt manners, and a stubborn streak that could humble dukes. Queen Victoria, who was not known for easy laughter or spontaneous affection, adored him. Not in theory, not as a nice idea, in practice, daily. After Albert's death, Brown became her most trusted companion. He called her woman, once reportedly told her to sit down when she was being dramatic, and was known to break royal protocol with the kind of regularity that made courtiers twitch. But Victoria didn't mind. She called him my dearest Brown. She let him in without ceremony. And when she was buried, his photograph, his handkerchief, and, most controversially, his mother's wedding ring were placed in her coffin. The ring was slipped on her finger, concealed under her glove. Her family did not approve. The rumors, of course, had already done their damage. Gossiping tongues had long speculated, was he a servant, a secret husband, a stand-in for Albert? Victoria never gave a definitive answer. She simply kept him close. Always. His portrait sat by her bedside. She wrote about him constantly in her journals, sometimes in euphemisms, sometimes not. And when he died in 1883, she was devastated. She commissioned a statue. She demanded his memory be protected. She even ensured he had his own gravestone near Balmoral. After her death, Edward VII had the statue removed and the more incriminating memorials scrubbed from sight. Brown was erased, but not quite. The ring remained. The portrait had already been packed for the coffin, and the Queen's private feelings, though heavily edited later by her daughter, survived in just enough traces to raise eyebrows for generations. But if John Brown was the ghost of her sorrow, Abdul Karim was the scandal of her sunset years, and his story came with curry powder, royal journals, and a flurry of Hindustani vowels. 5. Curry nights at the palace. By the late 1880s, Queen Victoria had a new favorite. His name was Abdul Karim, and unlike John Brown, he came from further afield, India specifically. He was supposed to be a ceremonial servant, a living diplomatic token brought to Windsor after the Jubilee. But very quickly, he became something else entirely. The Queen's teacher, correspondent, confidant, and to the rest of the court a walking diplomatic headache in a turban. Victoria called him the Munshi. She gave him rooms, titles, and an unprecedented level of access. He taught her Urdu phrases. She filled journals practicing them in careful script, underlining words like a schoolgirl. He cooked her curries, mild ones, tailored to her digestion, and soon, curry night became a staple at the royal table. British high society, ever the weather vane, began doing the same. But while the Queen basked in what she saw as cultural exchange, the rest of the royal household was in a state of barely contained panic. The idea of a Muslim commoner from Agra dining with dukes, giving language lessons to the Empress of India, and strolling beside her on palace grounds? Unacceptable. Not because of his religion or his background, at least not officially. It was his proximity to power. Proximity breeds suspicion. Despite the growing hostility, Victoria defended him fiercely. Letters between them multiplied. When she was ill, he was summoned. When he was slandered, she scolded her family. She even took him on royal trips, including to Balmoral, where the ghost of John Brown must have felt very seen. After her death, Edward VII did what he always did with her favorites. He shut it down. Abdul Karim was sent back to India, his letters confiscated, and his presence wiped from official records. But not from the palace kitchens. Because thanks to Abdul, curry was here to stay, and Victoria had been practicing her conjugations. And when she wasn't conjugating Urdu verbs, she was sketching her way through grief, boredom, and an ever-shrinking royal circle. 6. Sketch Queen, Queen Victoria. Empress, matriarch, ruler of nearly a quarter of the globe, and avid doodler. There is something oddly endearing, even disarming, about imagining the monarch of the British Empire hunched over a sketch pad, tongue poking out in concentration, drawing a rather lopsided corgi. But she did. Frequently. Her sketchbooks, which number well over 100, are filled with pencil studies, inked outlines, watercolors, and quick little scrawls of Highland landscapes, court scenes, footmen, and family pets. She drew her children as toddlers, her servants at rest, and her dogs. Always the dogs. They were often out of proportion, endearingly so. Tiny paws, giant ears, overfluffed tails. The sovereign of the 19th century had a serious case of canine sketch addiction. What's more impressive is that she didn't just draw when she was young and carefree. She drew through mourning. Her art became more than a pastime. It was a private therapy. While ministers debated global policy downstairs, Victoria sat upstairs sketching her maids and fiddling with watercolor gradients. She also kept copious journals, filling page after page with observations, emotions, complaints, and emotional weather reports from inside the fog of royalty. She could be poetic, petty, meticulous, self-pitying, deeply loving, or totally oblivious, all in the same paragraph. And every now and then, right in the middle of a political entry, she'd pause to draw a bonnet she liked. In the archive of her life, art and monarchy blended like ink in water. She wasn't always good. She wasn't always subtle. But she was relentless. A monarch who governed by day and scribbled by candlelight. Equal parts sovereign and schoolgirl. And speaking of school, her children didn't get off easy. Because the next royal house wasn't just a home, It was an educational laboratory with tartan wallpaper. 7. A very literal grandmother of Europe. By the dawn of the 20th century, Queen Victoria had stopped being a mere monarch and had become something else entirely, a family tree in a tiara. Her 9 children married into nearly every significant royal house across Europe, producing a dizzying, slightly inbred network of cousins, archdukes, tsars, kaisers, and empresses. It wasn't diplomacy. It was matchmaking with global consequences. At family reunions, she sat at the center of it all like a human game of Risk. One moment she was bouncing a toddler who would grow up to be Queen of Spain. The next she was scolding a teenage Wilhelm, the future Kaiser of Germany, for being too arrogant at dinner. And they all called her Grandmama. With some affection. With some fear. With a lot of protocol. This wasn't accidental. Victoria had views. Her children didn't marry for love. They married for strategy. A Danish princess here, a Russian Grand Duke there. Protestant, if possible. Royal blood, definitely. Love was optional. Empire was not. The result was what historians politely call dynastic entanglement, and what the rest of us might call the weirdest family reunion in history. When World War I broke out, it was literally a family squabble. The King of England, the Kaiser of Germany, and the Tsar of Russia were all Victoria's grandsons or in-laws. They wrote each other letters while mobilizing armies. The postcards were civil. The trench warfare not so much. Victoria herself didn't live to see the fallout, but she laid the foundations. She didn't just reign, she replicated. Across palaces, across borders, across cultures. She engineered royal bloodlines like a genealogical architect. And while the world watched her empire expand, she turned her attention to smaller matters. Loyal companions, four-legged courtiers, and tiny marble gravestones tucked into royal gardens. 8. The royal dog cemeteries. In most households, when a beloved dog dies, you get a shoebox, a backyard, and a tearful farewell under a half-dead rhododendron. In Queen Victoria's world, you got a stone monument, a landscaped graveyard, and maybe even a eulogy written in careful calligraphy by a footman. Victoria didn't just love dogs, she revered them. They were part of the court, part of the routine, part of the emotional infrastructure holding up a queen who had lost a husband, a friend, and the will to ever stop mourning. The dogs didn't ask questions. They didn't gossip. They followed her around Windsor, Balmoral, Osborne House, small yapping sentinels of unconditional loyalty. So when they died, and they often did, because palace life is not immune to fleas, age, or misadventure, they were buried with full honors. The royal dog cemeteries at Balmoral and Osborne were designed with the same fastidious care that Prince Albert once applied to palace plumbing. Tiny carved headstones bore names like Noble, Turry, and Sharp. Some had epitaphs. Others had little likenesses etched into marble, so their floppy ears could be remembered in perpetuity. Visitors were often surprised. They came expecting grandeur, and they found a pet graveyard tucked behind rose hedges. Children visiting the Queen would tiptoe through it, half curious, half reverent, like they were trespassing in a very solemn dollhouse graveyard. To Victoria, this wasn't whimsy, it was consistency. In a life governed by protocol and grief, the dogs were a rare kind of stability. They didn't care that she was queen. They cared that she came to breakfast. But Victoria didn't just bury her pets. She dressed them. Sometimes in tartan. Because after she met Scotland, even the dogs weren't safe from the cultural rebrand. 9. Tartan mania. Before Scotland became a sentimental, shortbread tin fantasy of bagpipes and heather, it was politically volatile and largely ignored by the southern elite. But then Queen Victoria went there, fell in love with the mist and mountains, and decided to Highlandify the monarchy. The year was 1842. Victoria and Albert made their first trip north and were immediately captivated by the drama of the landscape. Albert, being Albert, immediately began designing things, and Victoria, being Victoria, romanticized everything in sight. What followed was less a royal retreat and more a full-blown aesthetic takeover. They bought Balmoral, a granite-clad fantasy estate, and decorated it with a fierce devotion to all things Highland. Tartan carpets, tartan curtains, tartan kilts. The staff were dressed like extras in a Jacobite reenactment. The Queen even commissioned new tartan patterns, custom clan branding for the royals. Victoria learned to dance salies. Albert took gilly lessons. Together they staged picnics with bagpipes and theatrical deer hunts that bordered on cosplay. It was theatrical nationalism, wrapped in plaid and sprinkled with romantic fog, and the public ate it up. Soon, tartan went from clan identifier to fashion craze. Aristocrats began wearing it at dinner parties in Sussex. Tailors in London stocked patterns that no one could pronounce. The irony? The monarchy had once tried to suppress Highland culture after the Jacobite rebellions. Now it was packaging it as the royal family's rustic soul. At Balmoral, the Queen felt free. Free to walk, to sketch, to picnic, to grieve without ceremony. Scotland gave her a kind of emotional permission that England never did. And at the center of this plaid fever dream was Albert, the ultimate organizer, the relentless planner, the man who once micromanaged a urinal installation. But when he turned his eye to the world's biggest exhibition, he really went full Victorian. 10. The Great Exhibition. Showman, Prince Albert. In 1851, London became the center of the world, or at least, Prince Albert believed it should be. The occasion? The Great Exhibition of the Works of Industry of All Nations. A name so modest, you'd almost forget it was essentially the First World's Fair, a global celebration of innovation, empire, and very shiny things. And behind it all, tirelessly, neurotically, heroically, was Albert. He was not content to just lend his name. Albert was deeply involved in the planning, from architectural sketches to exhibitor lists to the placement of doorknobs. He handpicked exhibits, debated floor plans, and even got involved in the heating system. He was especially passionate about ventilation. Nothing was too small, nothing was left to chance. The crown jewel of the event was the Crystal Palace, a massive glass and iron structure dropped into Hyde Park like a greenhouse for human progress. It was so modern that even the trees were left inside, because Albert insisted on it. He wanted nature and industry to shake hands under one shimmering roof. The exhibits came from everywhere: American typewriters, Indian textiles, French porcelain, and a suspiciously large number of British steam engines. Over 6 million people came to see it, including Charles Darwin, Charles Dickens, and a good number of pickpockets. It was loud, crowded, wildly eclectic, and utterly Victorian in its ambition. Albert wandered the halls like a proud museum docent. He spoke to inventors, he corrected labels, he wrote memos. He was, as one courtier put it, constitutionally incapable of delegation. The exhibition made a profit, inspired copycats across the globe, and changed how nations thought about industry. And Albert? He got what he always wanted: proof that monarchy could be modern, useful, and smart, even if it involved telling engineers how to stack pipes. But behind the soaring glass and triumphant crowds, something darker lingered, a personal grief that no innovation could fix. So the Queen, ever faithful, decided to leave a monument of her own, not in iron, but in Highland granite. 11. A pyramid for Albert. High above the misty grounds of Balmoral, in a spot chosen with a mourner's precision, stands a stone cairn shaped suspiciously like a miniature pyramid. It's not Egyptian. It's not ancient. It's not even particularly stylish. But it's there, for Albert. After his death in 1861, Victoria began the long and intimate process of monument making, not for the empire, but for herself. The Albert Memorial in London was grand, gold-leafed, and public. But this was hers. A stack of granite boulders, each one heavy, cold, and unapologetically solid. Like grief, like memory, like the marriage that defined her. The cairn was built by local masons, not imported architects. It overlooks the Dee Valley, where they used to ride together. It's not flashy. It doesn't make announcements. It broods. Victoria would visit it regularly, sometimes alone, sometimes accompanied by loyal staff who understood not to speak. In her journals, she describes the spot in mournful detail, noting the wind, the moss, the view. She was cataloging the landscape of her sorrow. Visitors to Balmoral might not even know what it is. It doesn't have a guidebook spread. It's not postcard famous. But for Victoria, it was sacred. She had other cairns raised too, for children, for Brown, for milestones. But none like this. The pyramid was different. It wasn't just about Albert's death, it was about his permanence. She couldn't bring him back, but she could mark the earth. Forever. To this day, hikers stumble across it and wonder why it's there. No plaque explains it adequately. Just a name, a date, and a queen who outlived her joy. Still, for all her sorrow, Victoria never forgot how to celebrate. And sometimes, grief needed sugar, which is why one royal object survived not in stone, but in icing. 12. The wedding cake that wouldn't die. When Queen Victoria married Prince Albert in 1840, Britain got more than a royal union. It got a cake, a massive architectural, marvelously over-decorated cake. It stood over 3 yards in diameter and weighed several hundred pounds. It had sculptures. It had sugar work. It probably had its own gravitational field. And it refused to disappear. This was not your standard sponge with some frosting. This was imperial confectionery at its most ambitious. Decorative figurines of the bride and groom, topped with cupids and wreaths, loomed over tiers of floral icing. Allegorical scenes were piped in sugar, because nothing says matrimony like frosting that doubles as propaganda. But what's even more Victorian than excessive decoration? Preservation. As slices of the cake were cut and served to a carefully vetted guest list, the rest was distributed in ornate tin boxes, some to nobles, some to staff, some to people who'd never met the couple but moved in the right social orbit. Those pieces survived for decades. People tucked them away like relics. They were kept in cabinets, drawers, and curio displays. By the end of the century, some had crumbled into dusty sweetness. Others remained intact, dry, dense, and somehow still sacred. It became a trend, saving bits of royal cake. Victorian households proudly displayed uneaten slivers like tiny edible icons. Even today, one or two are rumored to exist in museums and private collections, sealed away like sugary fossils. Because in the Victorian imagination, nothing was too trivial to be archived, especially if it came with a royal seal. The cake may have symbolized joy, but what followed was decades of ritual, rules, and restraint. Because not long after the wedding came the trials of queenship, motherhood, and assassination attempts. And Victoria, being Victoria, chose to meet danger not with fear, but with lace, pearls, and an open carriage. 13. Open carriage courage. By the time Queen Victoria had survived her third assassination attempt, people were beginning to wonder whether she should stop parading around in an open carriage. She did not agree. In fact, she seemed to double down on it. In a time when monarchs were supposed to be above the rabble, but were increasingly targets of it, Victoria made a point of showing up, sitting tall, waving gently, and riding slowly through public streets with nothing between her and danger but a stiff breeze and a velvet hat. The logic was emotional, not tactical. This was a woman who had buried her husband, lost her mother in the same year, and become, essentially, a living statue in perpetual black. Fear? She had already made its acquaintance. So what did it matter if a man in the crowd raised a pistol or flung an insult? Her presence was the answer. The symbolism was not lost on her subjects. An aging queen, cloaked in mourning, riding into crowds unshielded. It struck a chord. It was monarchy as performance, vulnerability as propaganda. There was something defiant about her refusal to be hidden behind armored glass, even if her staff begged her to reconsider. She wouldn't, not out of recklessness, but from a belief that royal visibility was inseparable from royal duty. Besides, her enemies were rarely competent. One assailant's gun misfired. Another missed entirely. The most successful attacker was probably the man who flung a walking stick. But every time Victoria returned to her carriage, unchanged, unbowed, the people cheered louder. The monarchy survived on poise and ritual, and in Victoria's case, sheer obstinacy. But she wasn't just making public appearances. She was also recording them. And as it turns out, the Queen had an eye for portraits. Though not with a paintbrush, this time it was all about the lens. 14. The Queen and the Camera. Queen Victoria met photography when it was still an awkward, chemical-smelling novelty. More science fair than art form. She didn't care. She saw something in the stiff, sepia haze that resonated with her inner archivist. For a queen already obsessed with documenting her life in words and sketches, the camera was the next logical upgrade. She embraced it with royal intensity. Her first portraits were formal affairs, staged, heavily costumed, and extremely motionless. Exposure times were long, smiles discouraged, and posture mandatory. Yet she persisted. She posed with her children, with Albert, with her dogs, later alone. The early images are not exactly candid. They are Victorian to the bone, stoic, regal, and occasionally funereal. But then something changed. As photography became more accessible, Victoria grew playful. She started collecting cartes de visite, small photographic calling cards. Soon, so did everyone else. It became the royal version of baseball cards. Her image appeared in albums, on souvenir prints, and tucked into the pockets of loyal subjects across the empire. If there had been Instagram in 1860, she would have dominated the algorithm. She also commissioned portraits relentlessly, not just of herself, but of her extended family, her staff, her Highland gillies, even her Indian attendants. And she kept them organized, labeled, and cataloged in volumes that survive today as a sort of royal scrapbook/Hall of Fame. Nothing escaped the lens, not grief, not joy, not even awkward teenage grandsons in sailor suits. Photography offered her something portraiture never could: permanence without flattery. Truth, or at least the illusion of it. A way to see herself as the public did. A sovereign aging in real time, in real light. And if that sounds surprisingly modern, just wait. Because before there were filters and reels, there were fir trees and candlelight. And Victoria's household had the most Instagrammable Christmas tree in Europe. 15. Christmas tree. Trendsetters. Picture this. Windsor Castle, mid-1840s. Snow falling softly outside. Inside, in the drawing room, a giant fir tree glitters with candles, ornaments, and little baskets of sweets. At its base, a royal toddler tugs at a ribbon while a dachshund watches. And standing proudly nearby, Prince Albert, the original holiday influencer. Though Christmas trees had existed in German traditions for centuries, it was Albert who brought them into the British mainstream. In 1848, an illustration in the Illustrated London News showed the royal family gathered around their tree, complete with baubles, gifts, and children in absurdly formal outfits. The nation swooned. Overnight, having a Christmas tree became not just fashionable, it became patriotic. If the Queen did it, you did it. Trees appeared in parlors, churches, even workhouses. Shops started selling decorations. Enterprising Victorians made their own with paper, glass, and tinsel. And soon, Christmas looked like a proper Victorian spectacle. Sentimental, commercial, and faintly overwhelming. Albert was meticulous about it. He loved arranging the tree himself, down to the smallest ornament. He imported decorations from Germany, many handmade. He orchestrated the family gift exchange with the precision of a general preparing for battle. And Victoria for all her royal solemnity, adored it. In her journals, she described the tree with girlish glee, lit most brilliantly, loaded with beautiful things, and most charming. Christmas in the royal household wasn't just a holiday. It was a performance of order, affection, and carefully managed whimsy. A family event staged for national consumption. The perfect distraction from political instability, industrial unrest, or the relentless march of time. But not every phrase from that era was so sweet. Some were sharp, and one, in particular, may or may not have been uttered by Victoria herself. Either way, it became a legend, half truth, half punchline. 16. We are not amused. Maybe. If Queen Victoria had a catchphrase, it would be 4 words long, razor-edged, and endlessly quotable. We are not amused. The phrase has echoed through drawing rooms, school plays, and dry British sarcasm for over a century. But here's the twist. She might never have actually said it. The origins are murky. Some say it was uttered in response to an off-color joke told at court. Others believe it was deployed after a particularly undignified performance at one of her evening entertainments. And there are those who suspect the whole thing was a Victorian game of telephone. One woman's weary eye roll turned into a national meme. What is clear is that the phrase encapsulates something essential about Victoria's public image: reserved, moralistic, and just a bit terrifying. She was a woman who redefined the monarchy not through charisma, but through composure. When newspapers and satirists needed a line to pin on her, "We are not amused" fit like a corset, tight, formal, and slightly suffocating. Ironically, those who knew her best insisted she had a wicked sense of humor. Close friends described her as mischievous, capable of sudden laughter, and even fond of practical jokes, within reason, of course. But to the public, she became the emblem of restraint, the eternal widow, the amuseless monarch. And maybe that's why the phrase stuck. Not because it was accurate, but because it felt right. It turned the Queen into a symbol of dignity, of tradition, of imperviousness to nonsense. The kind of ruler who didn't flinch when faced with political chaos or a badly timed pun. But behind the formality, there was a mother. One who filled entire houses with the noise of children, tutors, schedules, and charts. Which brings us to the schoolroom that just so happened to be called a palace. 17. Osborne House as the schoolroom. To the average onlooker, Osborne House was a royal retreat, a seaside villa on the Isle of Wight, complete with Italianate terraces, rolling gardens, and imported Swiss chalets. But to Victoria and Albert, it was also an experiment in parenting, a royal petri dish for raising the next generation of monarchs, diplomats, and duchesses. It wasn't just a home. It was a hands-on school. Albert, ever the structured enthusiast, believed in the moral power of education. He and Victoria designed Osborne not as a leisurely summer escape, but as a carefully crafted training ground. Each room had a function. There were science corners, art corners, and designated areas for language drills, religious instruction, and musical study. Timetables were printed, bells were rung. Tutors came and went like clockwork. The royal children, all 9 of them, were not spoiled with idle luxury. They were drilled in math, handwriting, and multiple languages before they were tall enough to ride their ponies. Playtime was allowed, but only after the day's lessons had been completed and inspected. Even the architecture reflected this ethos, practical, airy, and filled with reminders that being royal didn't mean being idle. Victoria, for her part, admired this order, but she also brought a sentimental touch. Her journals are peppered with notes about the children's drawings, their funny phrases, their illnesses and recoveries. She wasn't a hands-off mother. She just had an empire to run while trying to memorize Latin conjugations with Lenchen. Osborne became a prototype for how royals could live semi-normally, if your definition of normal includes private tutors and a view of the Solent. It was, in essence, a domestic laboratory, balancing tradition with reform. But education wasn't just about books. Albert believed discipline began at dawn, and preferably in ice water. Welcome to the coldest parenting trend of the Victorian age. 18. Cold baths and clockwork days. Prince Albert approached child-rearing like a man designing a machine, precise, unyielding, and full of valves. At the heart of his parenting philosophy was a schedule so strict it could frighten a Prussian general, and the day began, invariably, with cold water. The royal children were roused early, sometimes before sunrise, and sent straight to the bath. No warming, no delay, just a brisk, shivering plunge into character building. It wasn't punishment, it was principle. Albert believed that cold baths toughened the will, trained the constitution, and taught resilience. A warm bath, presumably, bred poets and politicians of weak spine. From there the day unfolded with metronomic regularity. Morning prayers, hours of academic lessons, piano or violin practice, language repetition, exercise in the fresh air, and carefully timed meals. Free time was permitted, but only in controlled bursts. Think recess, not rebellion. Each child had a logbook. Progress was measured. Praise was rationed. Albert saw his role as more than father. He was moral engineer, hygiene consultant, and junior life coach. The goal wasn't happiness, it was competence. A new breed of royalty, less ornamental and more functional. Victoria supported this regime with a kind of weary respect. She deferred to Albert's plans and occasionally offered emotional commentary, but she rarely interfered. She too had been raised in a regime of duty over comfort. This just took it to the next, icier level. The children had mixed reactions. Some thrived. Others, like Princess Louise, rebelled in subtle ways. But one thing was certain. The rhythm of those early days, baths, bells, bows, and books, left its mark. The monarchs they became bore the discipline of those Osborne mornings in every speech, every salute, and every silent nod. And if you think cold baths were extreme, just wait until you meet the prince who could give a TED Talk on Victorian sewer systems. 19. The Prince Who Loved Drains. Again. For most people, sanitation is the sort of topic you pretend to care about while secretly zoning out. But for Prince Albert, it was the stuff of obsession. If monarchy was to modernize, then so must its bathrooms. And so, while other royals discussed policy and diplomacy, Albert turned his full attention to drains. He wasn't being metaphorical. He meant actual drains, pipes, ventilation systems, latrines, sewer lines. The kind of grimy underworld infrastructure that most aristocrats avoided thinking about unless it backed up during dinner. Albert believed the state of one's plumbing reflected the state of one's mind and soul. This wasn't an idle hobby. Albert immersed himself in the subject. He read treatises on sanitation reform. He met with engineers. He conducted site visits. He improved the palace's waste systems with an enthusiasm that bordered on the spiritual. Visitors to Windsor or Buckingham Palace sometimes found themselves cornered not by etiquette, but by the prince, who wanted to explain air circulation in the royal bedrooms. He lobbied for better drainage across London, horrified by the state of the Thames and the stench that often wafted into Parliament. The Great Stink of 1858 only confirmed his worst fears. London was, quite literally, a royal embarrassment, so he pressed for innovation and worked with figures like Joseph Bazalgette to implement large-scale sewer reforms. But he didn't stop at the city. Albert also focused on the palace itself. When the royal family relocated to Osborne House or Balmoral, he supervised the plumbing. He wanted fresh air, clean water, and modern toilets in every royal residence. Sanitation, for him, wasn't beneath royalty. It was at its very heart. His passion may have puzzled courtiers, but it meant the palace no longer smelled like the 18th century. And in the quiet, pipeline corners of Windsor, history was made, flush by flush. Of course, not every royal channeled their passion into sewage. Some preferred music. and one prince even swapped courtly duties for concertos. 20. A royal who really loved music, Prince Alfred, Duke of Edinburgh. When your mother is the Queen of England and your father is the most organized man in Europe, rebellion can take curious forms. For Prince Alfred, the second son of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, rebellion came with a bow and a violin string. Alfred didn't just dabble in music, he pursued it with fervor. While his elder brother, the future Edward VII, struggled under the burden of expectation, Alfred found solace in melodies. He studied the violin seriously, attended concerts with real enthusiasm, and was known to play in private ensembles with the kind of concentration usually reserved for diplomacy or dueling. This was not mere princely hobbyism. Alfred respected the craft. He practiced, he studied, he listened, and he surrounded himself with serious musicians, not just court flunkies willing to flatter a royal with a bow. He supported orchestras, commissioned works, and was a visible patron of musical institutions in Britain and abroad. When he wasn't playing, he was organizing concerts, sometimes in palaces, sometimes at naval bases. He was, after all, a naval officer as well. Imagine a young royal in uniform, switching between ship inspections and chamber music rehearsals. It was very Victorian, duty and diversion in equal measure. Victoria, to her credit, was supportive, even if she sometimes preferred simpler fare. She admired Alfred's devotion, and while she didn't share his passion for complex compositions, she recognized the value of it. A prince in tune, quite literally, with culture. Alfred's legacy in music wasn't transformative, but it was earnest. In an age of duty-first royals, he carved out space for something quieter, more human. A reminder that even in an empire obsessed with control, beauty still had a place. And speaking of beauty, one of Victoria's daughters didn't just admire it, she sculpted it with her own two hands and shocked the court in the process. 21. Princess Louise the Sculptor. Princess Louise, the sixth child of Queen Victoria, was not content to embroider cushions or host polite teas. Instead, she picked up a chisel and started carving busts. In marble, with her own royal hands. This was not expected behavior. Victorian princesses were meant to patronize the arts, not participate in them. But Louise, from a young age, demonstrated serious talent, and even more serious intent. She enrolled at the National Art Training School, worked alongside professional sculptors, and insisted on being treated like any other student, albeit one with palace security. Her work wasn't decorative fluff either. Louise produced public statues, including a prominent bronze of Queen Victoria that still stands in Kensington. Her art was bold, anatomical, and often controversial, not for its content, but for the fact that a royal woman was behind the mallet. This made the establishment deeply uncomfortable. The idea of a princess sculpting male nudes for anatomical study was almost too much for the Victorian mind to bear. Gossip swirled, etiquette cracked, but Louise ignored it all. She maintained her studio, wore practical clothes, and held salons with artists, thinkers, and radicals far outside royal norms. She was a boundary breaker in other ways, too. Her marriage to the Marquis of Lorne was unconventional, less political, more personal. She traveled, engaged with politics, and once caused a stir by bicycling through public streets unchaperoned. She was, in many ways, the anti-Victoria of the family. And yet, Victoria admired her daughter's independence, even if she didn't always understand it. Louise was proof that the Victorian ideal of femininity was not as monolithic as the portraits suggested, and she wasn't alone. Another princess picked up a needle and thread, not for leisure, but to build a national institution one stitch at a time. 22. Princess Helena's needlework empire. In an era when embroidery was considered a genteel pastime, Princess Helena took it somewhere unexpected, a national movement. As Queen Victoria's third daughter, Helena was never destined for political influence or artistic rebellion. But with a needle in hand, she quietly stitched her way into cultural legacy. Helena wasn't just passively fond of needlework, she was a visionary about it. In 1872, she co-founded what would become the Royal School of Needlework, an institution meant not only to preserve traditional techniques, but to elevate needlework as both art and industry. It wasn't just about doilies and samplers. Helena's version of embroidery came with employment contracts and public exhibitions. Her goal was as practical as it was patriotic: to provide respectable paid work for women, particularly those from middle-class backgrounds whose financial status didn't match their social expectations. In Victorian Britain, being poor was unfortunate. Being poor and respectable was nearly impossible. Needlework offered a lifeline. Under Helena's guidance, the Royal School didn't just teach stitches. It taught design, business, and professionalism. The institution produced pieces for royal commissions, international exhibitions, and even church restorations. Queen Victoria herself was a patron, and many royal garments included contributions from Helena's students and colleagues. Helena also wrote extensively about the subject, defending needlework against critics who dismissed it as trivial. To her, it was both cultural heritage and moral discipline, an emblem of Victorian industriousness wrapped in silk thread. Though less flamboyant than her siblings, Helena carved out a unique niche. The princess who believed that art could be useful, beautiful, and economically transformative. Her movement endures to this day in institutions still bearing her imprint. And while Helena edited stitches, her youngest sister would take on a much larger editorial task, slicing and rewriting their mother's words one journal at a time. 23. Princess Beatrice, Editor-in-Chief. Being Queen Victoria's youngest daughter came with certain expectations: loyalty, discretion, and, ideally, staying close to home. Princess Beatrice did all three, and then some. But her greatest and most controversial legacy wasn't royal service or ceremonial ribbon-cutting. It was editing her mother's voice. After Victoria's death in 1901, the Queen left behind an ocean of personal writings, over 60 years of journals, letters, and notes. The task of preparing them for posterity fell to Beatrice, who had long served as her mother's confidant, amanuensis, and shadow. What followed was one of the most ambitious editorial projects in royal history, and one of the most disputed. Rather than merely selecting and arranging, Beatrice rewrote. She didn't redact here and there. She transcribed the entire journal by hand, making cuts, softening language, rewording phrases, and, in some cases, removing entire entries. The original volumes were then destroyed, one by one. Bonfire editing. Beatrice believed she was protecting her mother's legacy. Victoria, after all, had written with astonishing frankness, her grief, her temper, her frustrations with ministers and children alike. To Beatrice, some of it was too raw, too private, or too politically risky to leave untouched. But in doing so, she sanitized history. Scholars today lament what was lost: authentic insight, emotional candor, the voice of a monarch not filtered through the lens of duty. What remains is still valuable, but always incomplete. We don't hear Victoria as she truly sounded. We hear her as Beatrice wanted her to be remembered. Still, there's something achingly loyal about it. A daughter preserving her mother, one edited sentence at a time. A final act of service in a lifetime of obedience. And while Beatrice tried to preserve the Queen's story, another sister chose to risk her own by breaking one of the household's strictest rules for the sake of compassion. 24. Princess Alice the Rule Breaker. Nurse. Among Queen Victoria's many children, Princess Alice often stood apart, not for rebellion, but for empathy. She was dutiful, yes, intelligent, certainly, but above all, she was profoundly human in a court that often prized decorum over kindness. And in 1878, during one of the worst moments of her life, that empathy cost her dearly. Alice was married to Louis IV, Grand Duke of Hesse, and had settled in Germany, far from her mother's shadow. She took her royal responsibilities seriously, especially during times of crisis. So when diphtheria swept through her household, infecting several of her children, she became both nurse and anchor. She read to them, sat with them, held their hands. Doctors had warned her about physical contact. No kissing, no close breathing. The disease spread easily, and already she had lost her youngest daughter, Marie. But when her son Ernest, distraught by the news of his sister's death, began to cry, Alice did what any mother might do. She bent down and kissed him. Within weeks, she had contracted the disease herself. She died on December 14th, the anniversary of her father Albert's death, at just 35 years old. The court was stunned. Victoria, already buried under decades of mourning, was shattered anew. But what haunted people wasn't just the tragedy, it was the tenderness. Alice broke the rule, not out of defiance, but out of compassion. In an era that prized stoicism, she chose softness. Her death became a kind of symbol, of maternal devotion, of quiet bravery, and of the fine, often invisible line between love and loss. And while Alice's tragedy came from touch, another sibling lived a life defined by distance, kept apart by illness, sheltered by protocol, and wrapped quite literally in velvet. 25. Prince Leopold's velvet slippers. Prince Leopold, Queen Victoria's youngest son, lived a life measured not in decades but in precautions. Born in 1853 and diagnosed with what we now know was hemophilia, Leopold's body could betray him with the smallest injury. A fall, a bump, even a stubbed toe might spiral into days of bleeding. In an age when medicine often did more harm than good, his condition made him both a cherished child and a walking emergency. He was smart, sensitive, and stubborn. But above all, he was swaddled. Not metaphorically, literally. His environment was managed down to the inch. Courtiers and nurses moved rugs to soften corners. Furniture was padded. Staircases became forbidden. And on his feet? Velvet slippers, soft, quiet, and endlessly symbolic. Those slippers became a quiet icon of his life, elegance paired with fragility. He wore them not for style, but for safety. They whispered as he walked, a subtle reminder that every step he took came with risk. Even within the palaces, he was never truly free to roam. Victoria adored him. He was her last son and her most delicate. She vacillated between protectiveness and frustration. She admired his intellect and wit. He was arguably the brightest of her children, but worried endlessly about his health. His every move triggered a wave of watchfulness, and yet he longed for independence. He even pursued a university education at Oxford, carefully managed but real. Leopold eventually married, became a father, and took on public duties. But the risks never vanished. He died at 30 after a fall in Cannes. A minor injury to most, a death sentence to him. His life was a paradox, deeply royal, deeply vulnerable, wrapped in velvet, both physically and symbolically. And while Leopold moved softly through life, one royal woman would step out with neck held high, boldly covered not in armor, but in pearls and chokers. 26. The chokers of Alexandra. Alexandra of Denmark, later Queen Alexandra, consort to Edward VII, entered the British royal scene with delicate features, a graceful manner, and one very persistent rumor, that she wore chokers to hide a scar. Some said it was from surgery. Others whispered about childhood injury. Alexandra herself never confirmed, and in true royal fashion she made the mystery into a trend. What started as personal accessory became national fixation. Alexandra appeared at dinners, ceremonies, and portraits with her neck elegantly wrapped in pearls, velvet ribbons, or jeweled bands. Soon every fashionable woman in Britain was imitating her. High society ladies attended balls wrapped in their own versions of the Alexandra collar, hoping to evoke the same cool poise. This wasn't just fashion. It was branding, centuries before Instagram. Alexandra projected grace under pressure. Her style was consistent, curated, and quietly defiant. If the scar existed, it became invisible. The choker said, "I control the narrative," and she had good reason to guard herself. Her marriage to Edward, Bertie to the family, was a delicate balancing act. He was gregarious, impulsive, and perpetually surrounded by scandal. She, by contrast, was dignified, composed, and famously kind. While Edward gallivanted, Alexandra smiled for portraits and soothed public opinion with nothing but charm and a well-timed curtsy. Behind the scenes, she endured personal tragedies, including the loss of children and increasing health struggles. Her hearing began to fail early in life, a fact she hid with grace. She communicated through gestures, lip reading, and strategic silence. The chokers in some ways symbolized all of it, a shield of elegance wrapped around vulnerability, and her sense of decorum extended to every living creature under her roof. At Sandringham, her estate with Edward, the royal household often looked less like a palace and more like a slightly disorganized zoo. 27. Alexandra's menagerie vibes. Sandringham House, the royal family's Norfolk retreat, was known for lavish dinners, shooting parties, and animals. Lots of them. Dogs, birds, ponies, and the occasional exotic guest wandered the estate like it was an Edwardian Noah's Ark, curated not by zoologists, but by Queen Alexandra and her soft spot for all things fluffy, feathered, or faintly chaotic. She adored animals with almost royal intensity. The grounds of Sandringham teemed with them. Dogs were everywhere, under tables, in laps, occasionally underfoot at formal events. Terriers, Bourgeois, and Japanese chin dogs were particular favorites. They appeared in portraits, posed in family photographs, and even received official burial plots once their royal services concluded. Birds, too, found a home under Alexandra's gentle rule. Aviaries were installed, and parrots sometimes mimicked guests to embarrassing effect. It was said that some visiting dignitaries were startled to be greeted by a squawked version of their own accent coming from the corner. The atmosphere was eccentric but charming. Alexandra's menagerie wasn't just decoration, it reflected her sensibility. Where Bertie brought order and scandal, she brought warmth. The animals became part of the household routine. Guests were expected to tolerate a bit of fur and feathers with their tea. It also played well in the press. In an age before reality television, the public adored any glimpse of royal domesticity. Sketches of Alexandra with her dogs or tending to her birds softened her public image and offered just enough intimacy to make the monarchy feel human, without any real vulnerability. But the domestic charm had its limits. Just beyond the parlor doors, her husband was reinventing another form of aristocratic style, not with animals, but with silk, cigars, and the jacket that would change men's fashion forever. 28. Edward, later 7, and the smoking jacket. Before he was King Edward VII, Bertie was Britain's most stylish liability. While Queen Victoria mourned in perpetual black, Bertie was blazing his own trail through the more relaxed and more socially combustible terrain of aristocratic nightlife. And at the center of that trail, a jacket. Not just any jacket. The jacket. The one that would lounge its way into sartorial history, the smoking jacket. Traditionally, Victorian gentlemen changed clothes as often as they changed their minds. Morning coats, riding coats, evening tails. The uniform of empire came with a lot of buttons. But Bertie, never one to suffer discomfort quietly, favored something new. A shorter, softer velvet or silk robe-like coat, designed for after-dinner cigar hour. Less military parade, more armchair diplomacy. He wore it so confidently, so repeatedly, that others followed suit, literally. The smoking jacket, originally intended to protect evening clothes from ash and odor, became a symbol of masculine ease. It whispered privilege. It lounged. It reclined in leather chairs and sipped brandy without spilling. Thanks to Bertie, it became not just a house garment, but a lifestyle. This shift in fashion coincided with a broader Edwardian loosening. Bertie's influence was less about revolution and more about relaxation. He made formality seem optional, at least in private. And with the smoking jacket came the smoking room, the men-only retreat of plush chairs, heavy curtains, and postprandial secrets. It's fitting, really. While Victoria ruled with upright rigidity, her son crafted an identity rooted in comfort, indulgence, and charm. He wasn't trying to be a modernizer, he was trying to be comfortable. The fact that it changed menswear forever? Just a happy side effect. And when it came to meals, Bertie didn't just dress the part, he engineered them. Because nothing says royal innovation like turning a 6-hour banquet into a streamlined feast. 29. Bertie's Turbo Dinners. For much of Victorian court life, dinner was less a meal and more a marathon. Multiple courses. Elaborate rituals. Wait times that could humble glaciers. But when Bertie, the future Edward VII, got involved, dining became, dare we say it, efficient. He loved food. He loved conversation. What he didn't love was sitting through 7 or 8 hours of formal dinner service with plates arriving like postal delays. So he fixed it. With the precision of a chef and the impatience of a man who'd rather be smoking a cigar, Bertie shortened royal dinners, condensed the courses, sped up the service. The result? The dinner a la Bertie model. Streamlined menus, faster pacing, and a focus on quality over sheer abundance. Though to be clear, there was still a lot of food. Dishes were rich, seasonal, and often extravagant. Game meats, oysters, pâtés. But they arrived in rhythm. No dead air, no ritualized waiting, just gastronomic momentum. And yet, he didn't skimp on drama. Bertie adored elaborate menus and theatrical presentation. Think sculpted jellies, towering centerpieces, and menus written in impeccable French, even when the diners barely spoke it. He understood that dinner wasn't just sustenance, it was theater. He just preferred it without intermissions. Guests were expected to keep up. Conversations flowed. Champagne flowed faster. Bertie, ever the bon vivant, held court with ease. He knew everyone's business and half their secrets. His dining table was as much a place for diplomacy as it was for duck à l'orange. Victoria, famously frugal in appetite, found it all a bit much. But Bertie's dinners set a new standard for aristocratic entertaining. He fed people quickly, richly, and often hilariously. Of course, not every evening ended in laughter. Sometimes all it took was a pack of cards to bring the royal house uncomfortably close to scandal. 30. The Tranby Croft. Baccarat kerfuffle. You wouldn't think a card game could rock the royal establishment. But in 1890, a private gathering at Tranby Croft, a country house in Yorkshire, turned into one of the most awkward public scandals of Edward VII's very social life. The issue wasn't who was invited. It was what they played, baccarat, and who allegedly cheated. The evening featured a glittering guest list of nobles, courtiers, and hangers-on. Among them was Sir William Gordon Cumming, a decorated army officer and noted social climber. Also present, the Prince of Wales himself, Bertie, serving as both participant and royal decoration. As the cards were dealt, the wine flowed, and the bets quietly piled up. A whisper began circulating among the guests. Gordon Cumming was using sleight of hand. Subtle, but effective. A handful of guests confronted him discreetly. He denied it, of course. But the stakes weren't just financial. They were reputational. Cheating in the presence of the heir to the throne wasn't just gauche. It was dangerous. In a desperate bid to keep things quiet, Gordon Cumming was persuaded to sign a document promising never to play cards again. An agreement intended to keep the scandal in-house. But naturally, it leaked. And once the press got hold of it, there was no putting the baccarat back in the box. The case went to trial. Edward was dragged in as a witness. Unprecedented and deeply embarrassing. Crowds packed the courtroom. The prince, ever poised, defended his version of events with regal detachment, but the damage was done. Gordon Cumming lost. Public trust in high society's honor codes took a hit, and the scandal stained Bertie's reputation just as he was nearing the throne. All this over a card game. But if the cards betrayed royalty that night, the dinner tables remained their safe haven, complete with sugar sculptures, edible landscapes, and more drama than a West End play. 31. Royal Table. Theatrics. To dine with the British royal family during the Victorian and Edwardian eras was to enter a theater of edible grandeur. These weren't meals. They were productions. The menu may have featured quail and aspic and champagne from before your birth, but it was the centerpieces that stole the show. At royal banquets, the food was often delicious. The table was ridiculous. Imagine sitting down to a 12-course feast, only to find a miniature battlefield made entirely of marzipan, occupying the space between you and the salt. Trees made of spun sugar, villages carved in ice, whole mythological scenes depicted in confectionery, complete with cherubs, swans, and golden bows. This was what Victoria and Albert, and later Edward VII, considered proper dinner atmosphere. It was all very subtle. These table displays were known as surtout de table, and they weren't just decorative. They served a function: to impress, to intimidate, to fill the awkward silences between dukes with the soft rustle of admiration. In the Victorian imagination, nothing said power quite like a lifelike sugar stag drinking from a mirror-glass pond while surrounded by edible reeds. Prince Albert, the original micromanager of royal aesthetics, brought a Germanic precision to the design of these spectacles. He curated table settings like a museum curator on a deadline. Forks were aligned with military accuracy. Napkins were folded with theological geometry. And the centerpieces? They told stories. Moral ones, cultural ones, occasionally imperial ones. The dinner table became a kind of edible propaganda. Queen Victoria herself was a light eater, famously indifferent to the elaborate food placed before her. But she appreciated the symbolism. These weren't just banquets. They were declarations. The British monarchy, in all its starch and splendor, was still the standard of refinement. And if that meant placing a 5-foot-high nougat obelisk in the middle of the table, so be it. Under Edward VII, the tone shifted from solemn to indulgent. Bertie embraced the performative nature of dining and turned it into a sport. Guests were expected to keep up with the pace of courses, yes, but also to admire the aesthetic effort. There were floral towers that defied gravity, centerpieces that rotated, and once, infamously, a fruit arrangement so enormous it blocked the entire left wing of the table from making eye contact with the right. This was not a setting for introverts. But the precision wasn't only for spectacle. Timing was strict. Courses followed each other with barely a pause. And if you missed your cue, if you spent too long admiring a sugar cathedral, you might find yourself politely moved along by a butler with a strong wrist and a cold stare. And once the last truffle had been consumed and the last sugar swan had been silently mourned, it was time for the next act: fresh air, fresh powder, and shooting schedules. Because in Edwardian court life, sport was just as ceremonial as supper, and woe betide the guest who was late for a Sandringham shoot. 32. Sandringham Sport O'Clock. At Sandringham, Edward VII's beloved country estate, the pace of life was measured not in hours, but in cartridges. If Windsor was where Victoria mourned and Balmoral where she brooded, Sandringham was where Bertie optimized everything for the pursuit of sport. It was, in effect, a finely tuned machine built for leisure, with royal punctuality enforced like military drill. The Sandringham shooting parties were legendary, not for their glamour, but for their discipline. Guests were summoned by gongs, whistles, and sometimes sharp raps on the guest room door. Being late to a shoot wasn't a social faux pas, it was an act of war. Bertie did not tolerate dawdling, even in the name of digestion or dressing. Shooting began promptly. Guns were distributed, positions assigned. The beaters, local men paid to flush out game, marched ahead like a small, scrappy infantry, and the royal guests, nursing mild hangovers and faint indigestion from the previous night's epic meal, were expected to shoot with skill, speed, and absolute good humor. The birds? Less enthusiastic. But this wasn't just about hunting. It was court theater, with mud on the boots. The pecking order of the day, who stood where, who got the most kills, who retrieved their own game versus who had a valet for that, spoke volumes. It was diplomacy by double barrel. Bertie himself was a crack shot. He didn't just play the role, he earned it. Even in his portlier years, he managed to maintain the image of a gentleman athlete. His daily schedule revolved around the shoot. Breakfast, shoot, luncheon, shoot, tea, dress, dinner, cards, repeat. And everything happened on time. That was the Sandringham rule. It didn't matter if you were a viscount or a visiting monarch. If you held up the beaters, you'd find yourself on the receiving end of one of Bertie's famously frosty silences. What made it all remarkable was the blend of luxury and strictness. You could be standing in a perfectly tailored coat worth more than a farm, surrounded by footmen with silver thermoses, and still feel like you were at basic training for the aristocracy. That was the genius of Sandringham. Comfort disguised as discipline, pleasure disguised as duty. But sometimes royal routines got interrupted by something even more permanent than punctuality. Like ink, like needles, like the indelible marks made during one very unusual royal world tour. 33. 2 sailors, 2 tattoos. In 1881, 2 young British princes boarded a naval ship and set off on what was meant to be a diplomatic world tour and educational exercise. Princes George and Albert Victor, the grandsons of Queen Victoria, were not exactly hardened seafarers, but they returned with something that would last a lifetime. Tattoos. Yes, tattoos. It may surprise modern ears, but in the late 19th century, tattoos were enjoying a certain popularity among European aristocracy, especially those with naval leanings. The practice had filtered back through colonial contact, particularly in Asia and the Pacific, and had gone from being associated solely with sailors and prisoners to becoming a curious sign of worldly experience. So when young Prince George, the future George V, and his elder brother Albert Victor, known as Eddie, visited Japan, they did what many fashionable Western travelers did at the time. They visited a tattoo artist. And not just any street vendor with a needle. These were carefully arranged, semi-formal appointments with respected tattooists, often hosted in diplomatic circles. There was no back alley. There were tea sets. George received a dragon tattoo on his arm, a traditional Japanese design that marked him permanently as someone who had crossed oceans and participated in a bit of cultural tourism. Eddie followed suit. It was less rebellion than rite of passage, a royal badge of exoticism. Queen Victoria was less thrilled. Although she appreciated the boy's naval service and international exposure, she didn't quite picture imperial diplomacy leaving permanent ink on royal flesh. But George was undeterred. He would go on to become an avid collector. Of stamps, yes, but also of experience. And the tattoo was just one of many souvenirs from a lifetime spent balancing protocol with curiosity. The tattoos themselves were rarely shown in public, of course. This was still the Victorian era, where even an exposed forearm could make someone reach for smelling salts. But beneath the layers of uniform and etiquette, a dragon lay in wait. A whisper of a wilder world, etched in ink and memory. And speaking of collections, Prince George's love for tattoos was only matched by his passion for something even more addictive. Postage. 34. George's stamp. Obsession. Begins long before George V became king. He was a boy with a magnifying glass, a pair of tweezers, and a highly questionable definition of fun. While other princes rode horses, played cricket, or got into scandalous mischief, young George fell hard for something a little more adhesive. Postage stamps. It began innocently enough. A few clippings from foreign letters, some curious designs, tiny portraits of obscure monarchs with suspicious mustaches. But what started as a modest collection soon evolved into a full-blown royal obsession. And not just a passing whim. George built one of the most comprehensive and valuable stamp collections in the world. Quietly, methodically, like a true philatelic zealot. He didn't just hoard stamps, He studied them. George understood the difference between watermarks, perforation types, and misprints. He corresponded with other collectors. He made detailed annotations. He even reorganized entire albums for optimal presentation. He wasn't playing at it, he was doing the work. To most of the court, this seemed charming, if a bit peculiar. Here was a prince, eventually a king, who could recognize a rare Mauritius post office issue on sight, but routinely forgot which foreign dignitary he was supposed to be shaking hands with. But George didn't care. Stamps were order. Stamps were history in miniature. Stamps were a safe kingdom, one that could be ruled with tweezers and logic, not gossip and war. He invested time, money, and even a bit of royal prestige into the hobby. In 1890, he became honorary vice president of the Royal Philatelic Society. He also purchased some of the rarest stamps ever issued, including color variant rarities and discontinued colonial prints. His collection would eventually become the Royal Philatelic Collection, an official institution still maintained today, and widely considered the most valuable stamp archive in existence. What made the obsession fascinating wasn't just its scale, it was the contrast. Here was the future monarch of the British Empire, overseeing global conflicts and constitutional crises, while quietly rearranging his Samoa pages for thematic consistency. He could rule over millions by day and then spend the evening debating the authenticity of a dubious Cape Triangular. And in an era where power was loud and public, George's devotion to something as modest as a stamp album was almost radical. It was private. It was quiet. It was orderly in a way the world never was. But George wasn't the only royal with a rebellious hobby. His aunt, Princess Louise, didn't just ride bicycles. She did it wearing trousers and with a sketchbook in her satchel. Because in the royal court, few acts were as disruptive as riding in public with no carriage, no chaperone, and absolutely no apologies. 35. The Artist Princess on a Bicycle. Louise. Princess Louise was the sort of Victorian royal who caused butlers to drop teacups. Not with scandal, but with independence. The sixth child of Queen Victoria and Prince Albert, she was many things: a sculptor, a traveler, a quietly progressive thinker, and perhaps most shockingly to her era, a cyclist. At a time when women were expected to glide, not pedal, Louise took to her bicycle like it was a symbol of personal agency, which of course it was. Victorian society had long associated cycling with social transgression. Women who rode were accused of impropriety, of indecency, even of disrupting their internal organs. And Louise? She rode anyway. She wasn't merely playing at freedom. Louise had already made waves as a working sculptor, producing public art and studying anatomy in a male-dominated profession. She had taken commissions, mingled with avant-garde artists, and challenged the palace's idea of what a princess ought to be doing. So when she pedaled through London parks or down country lanes, it was just one more act of quiet defiance. She often wore practical skirts, sometimes even trousers disguised under layers, and sketched what she saw on her rides: cityscapes, country barns, workers in the field. She approached the world with an artist's eye and a traveler's curiosity. Riding wasn't just about speed, it was about observation. She moved through spaces not as a symbol, but as a person. Louise also enjoyed the solitude that came with riding. In a world where her every movement was monitored, the act of cycling offered temporary escape, freedom of motion, freedom of thought, and a few precious minutes when no one could correct her posture. The public, predictably, was intrigued. Some found her eccentric. Others saw her as a role model. The press alternated between admiration and alarm. But for Louise, none of that mattered. She kept riding. She kept sculpting. She kept living like a royal who'd rather chisel than curtsy. And when the palace grew too stiff, she found her own form of theater, complete with costumes, scripts, and makeshift stages where royalty got to play pretend. 36. Royal Amateur Theatricals. When the royal family got bored, and they often did, they didn't just host a dinner or call for a string quartet. No, they put on plays, real ones, with scripts, props, and enough melodrama to make Shakespeare blush. These were the Royal Amateur Theatricals, a cross between a high society drama club and an aristocratic fever dream. Held in drawing rooms and private palace theaters, the productions were elaborate affairs. Costumes were rented or made, sets were constructed, and royal children were cast in roles that ranged from sullen villagers to overacted ghosts. Queen Victoria herself was a fan, though she rarely performed. Instead, she played the ideal audience member, solemn, slightly confused, but deeply appreciative. The performances were a family affair. Princes played peasants. Duchesses played comic relief. It was make-believe, but with the full weight of imperial prestige behind it. Scripts were often edited to remove any content considered inappropriate, though what passed for inappropriate was often wildly inconsistent. Princess Louise, of course, was a favorite on stage, charismatic, expressive, and utterly unafraid to ham it up in front of a room full of relatives. Other royals followed suit. Even Edward VII got in on the act, occasionally performing or directing with the same booming authority he used for Parliament openings. These performances were more than entertainment. They were bonding rituals. Inside the tight, tradition-bound palace walls, theater offered an outlet for emotion, for experimentation, and for occasionally poking gentle fun at themselves. Jokes about court protocol? Allowed. Slight jabs at one another's quirks? Encouraged. It was, in its way, the one sanctioned moment of personal expression inside a system that suppressed it at every turn. The costumes were stored in trunks. The scripts, sometimes annotated in royal handwriting, became souvenirs, and the memories, preserved in that most Victorian of formats, photograph albums, because if it wasn't documented, did it even happen? 37. A craze for photograph. Albums. Victorian sentimentality had a format, and it came bound in leather, embossed in gold, and filled with the soft rustle of heavy cardstock pages. The photograph album. The royal family didn't just participate in the 19th century photography boom, they became its most compulsive archivists. If something existed in the world of Queen Victoria, there's a decent chance it was posed, captured, printed, mounted, and captioned in carefully cursive script. These weren't vanity projects either, at least not exclusively. The albums were sprawling, multi-volume chronicles of court life, royal pets, Highland servants, visiting dignitaries, and every child who had ever sat still for 5 seconds in the presence of a camera lens. Nurses were photographed, gardeners, gillies, even furniture occasionally made cameo appearances if the light was good and the composition worked. The Queen herself kept dozens of albums, so did her children. They were arranged with the precision of a genealogical archive. Birthdays, holidays, state visits, foreign travels, baptisms, funerals. Pages told silent stories, frozen in sepia, a picnic on the lawn, a child in mourning, a dog asleep on a cushion next to Albert's empty chair. What made the albums uniquely Victorian was their seriousness. These weren't whimsical family snapshots. They were legacy documents, sentimental inventories, emotional filing systems. Each photograph was carefully mounted with those little corner clasps labeled in ink and slotted into its proper context. An 1860s photo of a footman's retirement might sit beside one of a grandchild's christening, because in Victoria's court, memory didn't discriminate. Photography was still relatively new. It carried weight. A single image felt like an act of preservation, almost spiritual. In an empire obsessed with hierarchy and legacy, the photograph album was a form of control, capturing people, emotions, and moments that might otherwise slip into the ether. It also offered a kind of visual truth that painting never could. There were no flattered jawlines, no improved waistlines. Children squinted. Dogs looked the wrong way. Royalty looked tired. But in that realism was a peculiar charm, proof that even in a palace, someone had to blink. The tradition continued for decades. George V expanded the archive. Later monarchs inherited it, expanded it, digitized it. But the original volumes remain, a thick, bound, heavy monument to a family that was always performing, even when it was just sitting still. But of course, the royal family didn't just archive the living. They had an appetite for the other side too, especially at Balmoral, where the air was thick with mist and the fireside stories had more shadows than light. 38. Balmoral Ghost Stories. Balmoral Castle, Victoria's beloved Highland retreat, had a kind of fog that wasn't just weather, it was atmosphere. The stone walls absorbed silence, the pines loomed a little too close, and the night, when it fell over the mountains, seemed to drag something else along with it, something a little colder, a little older, a little more persistent. It was the perfect setting for ghost stories. Victoria, famously fond of the dramatic, leaned into the Gothic textures of Balmoral like a seasoned novelist. The place already carried emotional weight, her retreat with Albert, her hiding place in grief, her emotional sanctuary from the constraints of London. So when the sun dipped below the heather, the castle's corridors often became stages for shadowy tales. Guests recalled strange sounds in the halls, creaking steps with no source, whispered voices, cold spots near staircases. Footmen reportedly avoided certain parts of the castle at night. And while no official ghost was ever confirmed, the Queen's journals do mention odd disturbances that she refused to dismiss entirely. Victoria loved a fireside tale. On rainy Highland evenings, with the wind whining against the stone, the family would gather near the hearth while someone, often one of the younger royals, read aloud from Gothic novels or recounted second-hand stories of hauntings in Scottish folklore. The Queen, bundled in shawls, listened intently, occasionally contributing with stories of her own, usually involving omens, dreams, or eerie feelings she'd once had in a hallway. But it wasn't all theatrics. There was a strange comfort in these stories. They gave shape to unspoken fears. They dignified grief. And for a queen who believed in legacy, the idea that something lingered beyond death was quietly appealing. Especially at Balmoral, where Albert's absence felt so heavy, he may as well have had his own shadow. Of course, not every royal disturbance required ghosts. Sometimes, all it took was rain and the precise choreography of an army of umbrellas marching in absurd harmony. 39. The Umbrella Brigade. Rain, in Britain, is not an event. It is a condition of life. But in Queen Victoria's royal household, even the weather was subject to protocol. Enter the Umbrella Brigade, a marvel of synchronization, decorum, and quiet absurdity that turned a common drizzle into an oddly dignified ballet. When rain clouds gathered over Windsor or Balmoral, the staff didn't just grab umbrellas. They mobilized. Uniformed footmen, ladies' maids, secretaries, and messengers all seemed to emerge simultaneously, each with identical umbrellas held at identical angles. It was said that if you stood on a balcony during a royal downpour, you could watch a geometric formation of parasols drift across the gravel paths like a slow-moving ink blot. The Queen, of course, had her own umbrella, monogrammed, discreet, and black. But what made the routine so hypnotic was the visual rhythm of the rest. The staff's umbrellas didn't just keep people dry. They reinforced hierarchy. One footman, one umbrella. A lady of rank, two umbrellas, one for her, one trailing behind her for unexpected gusts. If a member of the royal family was due to emerge from a carriage, 3 umbrellas might be deployed in quick succession to form a portable awning. It was ridiculous. It was perfect. Guests were warned not to bring their own umbrellas unless they wanted to look like amateurs. When in royal company, one did not open an umbrella. One was covered. And if you strayed from your designated coverage zone, there would be a discreet correction. No scolding, just a gentle repositioning. The rain would fall where it pleased, but the royal household had its counterformation. Even in nature's chaos, there was choreography, and it didn't stop at umbrellas. The palace was full of surprising spectacles, some feathered, some furred, and one of them notorious for shouting cheeky remarks at passing diplomats. 40. Pet parrot diplomacy. In a palace filled with stiff uniforms, ancient protocols, and the daily grind of ceremonial duty, the royal parrots brought something unexpected: chaos with feathers. Queen Victoria, for all her reputation as the dour widow of empire, had a well-documented fondness for animals, and among the most colorful, literally and figuratively, were her parrots. These weren't just pretty cage fillers. They were talkers, commentators, occasional diplomatic liabilities. Victoria's favorite parrot was a blue and yellow macaw known for mimicking voices with unsettling accuracy. Visitors to the palace, foreign dignitaries, politicians, extended family, might be greeted not with a royal nod but with a shrieked "Who's there?" from across the drawing room. The parrot had learned phrases from staff, courtiers, and possibly the queen herself. One particularly famous anecdote involved the bird loudly imitating a coughing fit during a very serious audience, causing a stifled diplomatic incident followed by several footmen attempting to remove the bird mid-wheeze. The queen was delighted. She reportedly kept parrots at both Windsor and Osborne House, often in proximity to her private sitting rooms. She enjoyed their company, their unpredictability, and, perhaps most of all, the fact that they seemed entirely unimpressed by rank. A baron and a butler were equally likely to be heckled. In a world stratified by birth and bowing, the parrot answered to no one. But the parrots also served a quieter function. For a monarch so surrounded by ceremony, their presence provided something rare: unscripted noise, spontaneity, even affection in their own manic way. They broke the fourth wall of court life. Of course, not all visitors understood the joke. Some mistook the chatter for eavesdropping servants. Others, unfamiliar with parrots at all, treated the birds as royal omens. One French diplomat reportedly refused to speak in the Queen's salon after being mocked mid-sentence by a parrot trained to mimic court gossip. Nevertheless, the birds remained. Victoria's diaries mention them fondly, usually with brief notes like "chattering all morning" or "very tiresome today," which in Queenspeak was probably high praise. The parrots were never formal members of the household, but they might as well have been. They had names, personalities, vices, and when they died, some were buried in the royal pet cemeteries alongside the dogs who never learned to talk back. And speaking of indulgences, Victoria's sweet tooth was not just the stuff of rumor. Behind the black veils and state dinners, there was a woman who could demolish a pudding faster than she signed a royal assent. 41. Sweets at Windsor. Queen Victoria, Empress of the largest empire the world had ever known, ruler of dominions that spanned continents and oceans, had a soft spot for cake. And not the dainty, lace-doily kind of cake either. We're talking hearty puddings, sugar-glazed treats, and desserts so dense they could probably stop a musket ball. Behind all the iron decorum and institutional solemnity was a woman with a thoroughly unapologetic sweet tooth. At Windsor Castle, one of her favorite residences, dessert wasn't just a course, it was an art form. The royal kitchens, legendary for their size and precision, operated with the efficiency of a military campaign. And at the end of every lavish banquet or modest luncheon, a parade of puddings would make their entrance. Cabinet pudding, plum cake, fruit jellies, cream tarts, almond sponge, and, always, jam. Victoria liked simple things. She may have presided over banquets adorned with sugar palaces and floral towers, but what she reached for was often much humbler. A buttery scone, a syrup-soaked sponge, a slice of seed cake with her afternoon tea. She famously adored chocolate, though not in delicate praline form. She preferred solid, honest bars, ideally not too bitter. The royal menus, still preserved in archives, show a near-daily presence of puddings, tarts, or baked treats. And while the Queen's overall appetite was modest, particularly compared to her son Bertie's Olympian feasts. She made exceptions when sugar was involved. Her ladies-in-waiting noted that her eyes visibly lit up at the sight of a proper dessert tray. These indulgences didn't stop at mealtime. Victoria would send cakes to friends and family, commission sweet baskets as gifts, and even comment on the quality of desserts in her correspondence. A good pudding was worth a paragraph. A bad one, a royal sulk. The affection was personal too. Certain sweets were tied to memories. Albert's favorites, childhood tastes, the simple fare of Osborne House. In a life layered with diplomacy and protocol, sweets offered Victoria something rare, uncomplicated pleasure. But for her sons, especially young Arthur, pleasure came not from puddings, but from pageantry. And while other boys played with wooden horses, Arthur lined up battalions, marched across carpets, and staged battles with the precision of a budding general. 42. Miniature soldiers and big drills. Prince Arthur. Some children outgrow their toy soldiers. Prince Arthur, Queen Victoria's third son, merely expanded his army. From an early age, Arthur showed a startling devotion to all things military. His nursery floor was less a playroom and more a battlefield in waiting. Tin soldiers marched in tight formation. Tiny cannons were aimed with uncanny precision. His toy regiments were not scattered across the carpet but strategically deployed. Even his siblings were drafted, willing or not, into imaginary campaigns conducted with suspiciously real tactics. Victoria, ever the documentarian, took note. Arthur wasn't just pretending. He was studying. His passion for the military wasn't a passing fancy. It was a calling. While other children played at bravery, Arthur memorized ranks, uniforms, and regimental histories. And when the time came, he joined the army not as a token royal, but as a committed officer. His lifelong military career included service in various parts of the empire, Canada, India, Ireland, and culminated in a stint as commander-in-chief of the forces. He was no desk-bound noble. Arthur insisted on drills, on standards, and on discipline. Soldiers under his command often remarked that he was tough, yes, but fair, and deeply invested in the troops' welfare. But long before the medals and mustaches, there was the boy general, standing in his room at Buckingham Palace, directing an invisible army, whispering orders to pewter battalions, and choreographing battles on the velvet rugs. His mother, though not thrilled with the martial obsession, recognized it as a form of royal service. Unlike Bertie, Arthur never tested her patience with scandal. His uniform, both real and imagined, was always crisp. And in a household of royals playing roles, Arthur may have been the only one who rehearsed his with salutes before breakfast. But not all royal habits were so noble. Some, like Bertie's love of collecting canes, hats, and gentlemanly gadgets, bordered on obsession. Because even kings need hobbies, and some just prefer them in leather cases. 43. The heir who collected everything, Bertie. Before he was Edward VII, he was just Bertie, heir apparent, chronically undersupervised, and an unrepentant collector of stuff. Not stamps like his nephew, not teacups or rare books or coins. Bertie collected kit, gentleman's gear, walking sticks, canes, umbrellas, fobs, lighters, scent bottles, smoking accoutrements, monogrammed brushes, engraved cases, miniature tools. If it could be clasped, engraved, or carried in a waistcoat pocket, Bertie probably had two. It wasn't hoarding. Not exactly. It was accessorized dominance. He curated his collection with the meticulousness of a man who understood the social economy of a well-made object. Everything he carried, displayed, or wore sent a signal. I have taste. I have money. I'm the future king, and I travel with more gadgetry than a Swiss Army knife and a silk waistcoat. Bertie's walking sticks alone could have filled a small armory. Some were decorative. Others had secret compartments for notes, perfumes, or, allegedly, very small flasks. A few were rumored to contain swords, though that may have been Victorian exaggeration. Still, if ever there were a duel at the opera, Bertie would have been ready. His dressing rooms were temples to gentlemanly preparedness. Dozens of gloves, brushes made of silver and ivory, a monogrammed cigar cutter for every conceivable tobacco emergency. One observer described his toiletry kit as a traveling department store. Even his handkerchiefs had personality. Why? Perhaps it was a form of control. The monarchy was changing. Politics were evolving. Scandal was never far away. But here, in the tangible world of curated objects, Bertie could assert his preferences, his style, his mastery over the small things. He couldn't always control headlines, but he could absolutely ensure his matchbox was engraved in the appropriate font. In private, this collecting was a form of comfort. In public, it was branding. Bertie understood the optics of elegance. He wasn't just dressing for the part, he was outfitting a persona. A well-accessorized air was a reassuring air, especially in a world where royalty had to compete with self-made millionaires and celebrities of stage and scandal. Even in his later years as king, he maintained the habit. His rooms were still filled with gentlemen's items, and staff sometimes found it easier to buy him a new walking stick than to locate the specific one he'd misplaced during breakfast. But for all his taste in trinkets, Bertie wasn't the only family member turning royal life into artistic experiment. His sister Louise preferred marble to velvet, and her favorite sculpting subject just so happened to be one of her own brothers. 44. A princess who sculpted her brother's bust. Louise and Arthur. Princess Louise was many things: artist, rebel, cyclist, breaker of Victorian etiquette, but among her more unexpected projects was a sculpture that turned sibling affection into chiseled granite. The subject? Her brother, Prince Arthur. The setting? A royal sitting room temporarily transformed into a sculptor's studio. The result? A bust that captured not only Arthur's military stoicism, but also the peculiar dynamic of sculpting someone you occasionally argue with at dinner. Louise, unlike many royals who dabbled in art, was a real sculptor. She trained seriously, exhibited publicly, and took her work to heart. She preferred realism over flattery. Which meant Arthur, buttoned up, regimented, and slightly uncomfortable in the sculptor's chair, was not going to get the marble version of a flattering Instagram filter. Sessions were long. Marble is unforgiving. Louise sketched, measured, and chipped away while Arthur held as still as a human statue, only occasionally interrupting with a grumble or a strategically timed sigh. He was a soldier, yes, but not an actor. Sitting for your sister while she scrutinized your bone structure with surgical intensity wasn't exactly relaxing. Still, he agreed to it, likely out of sibling loyalty, possibly out of quiet admiration. Louise was formidable. She worked in a male-dominated field, refused to play the Victorian princess game, and had carved sculptures of public figures with more polish than many court-approved artists. The bust was eventually completed and publicly displayed. It showed Arthur in military attire, naturally, with a gaze that was equal parts dignified and slightly resigned, perhaps reflecting both his actual personality and his feelings about being immortalized by his younger sister. The public praised it, critics admired it, and Victoria, who didn't always understand Louise's artistic choices, approved with cautious maternal pride. But behind the marble was a story of royal relationships, a mix of affection, obligation, and the strange intimacy of holding still while someone literally carves your face. And yet, this family dynamic was nothing compared to the musical chairs of royal matchmaking, especially when one princess ended up engaged to one brother and married the other. 45. Royal matchmaking like musical chairs. The story of Mary of Teck reads like a royal rom-com written by someone with a dark sense of humor and no patience for sentiment. Born into nobility, admired for her poise and known for her practicality, Mary was first engaged to Prince Albert Victor, Queen Victoria's grandson and second in line to the throne. He was charming. He was fashionable. He was also, depending on who you ask, not quite suited for the top job. But duty called. The engagement was arranged, the wedding plans begun, and then, quite suddenly, Albert Victor died of pneumonia in 1892. Mary was 24. The mourning period began. In another world, that might have been the end of her royal trajectory. But the House of Windsor had a practical streak, and Queen Victoria had a long memory. Mary had been well-liked, respectable, steady. She had already been semi-integrated into the family machine. And so, 2 years later, Mary became engaged again, this time to her deceased fiancé's younger brother, Prince George. Yes, that Prince George, the future George V. He had been close to his brother, close to Mary, and, perhaps most importantly, understood what was at stake. It was an arrangement of grief and pragmatism. The family, the line of succession, the monarchy's emotional equilibrium, everything depended on it. So they married. And to everyone's surprise, the marriage worked. George was reserved, serious, obsessively fond of stamps. Mary was composed, intelligent, and capable of projecting both warmth and intimidation, sometimes in the same breath. They developed a genuine partnership, grounded not in romantic infatuation, but in mutual respect and a shared sense of duty. It was very Victorian, really. A love born not of passion, but of persistence. Mary became queen. She supported George through war, reform, scandal, and the slow unraveling of the old world. She dressed impeccably, collected Fabergé, and never forgot a name or a grudge. And yet, she never spoke much publicly about her first engagement. Perhaps she didn't need to. The history was there, in the portraits and the timelines and the names inscribed in church registers. A woman who was almost queen to one man, and became queen to his brother instead. And if that sounds like the most unusual match the royals ever orchestrated, just wait. Because before long, there would be talk of even stranger guests wandering the palace lawns, including allegedly a wombat. 46. A wombat at court. Almost Victorian royal life was a symphony of spectacle, tradition, and taxidermy. The British Empire was at its most expansive, and that meant not only territory and tribute but gifts, especially the living, breathing kind. Lions, tigers, zebras, and the occasional wombat. Yes, a wombat. Possibly more than one, depending on which courtier's diary you believe. Exotic animals became unofficial ambassadors, shipped from far-flung colonies and loyal admirers to Windsor, Balmoral, and other royal residences. These creatures were not always delivered with care, nor with any idea of where they were meant to go once they arrived. Some were sent on to the London Zoo. Others stayed just long enough to startle guests, amuse children, or become the subject of curious anecdotes. The story of the wombat, probably from Australia, definitely confused, and reportedly very grumpy, is one such tale. Though it's unclear whether the creature actually roamed the palace lawns freely, or was confined to a courtyard or royal enclosure, the fact that multiple sources mention it at all gives it a semi-mythic status among royal animal lore. One visitor to the palace described a squat, furry creature near the kennels, while another recalled a low beast that seemed to resent hats. It may have been a wombat. It may have been a very disgruntled dog, but the story stuck, and over time it has become part of the broader, and more bizarre, Victorian tradition of ad hoc animal diplomacy. Queen Victoria herself was reportedly amused by these gifts, but practical. She liked animals, certainly, but she liked order more. If an animal could not be housed, fed, or catalogued properly, it was likely redirected to a zoo or private menagerie. Still, for a brief moment, the idea of a wombat waddling past the Balmoral stables or sneezing in front of a startled footman became part of the royal mythos. The palace's odd fauna collection wasn't just about novelty, it was a side effect of empire. The farther the British flag flew, the stranger the tributes became. Elephants, monkeys, parrots, tortoises, creatures from every climate found themselves in carriages and crates, traveling seas to amuse a monarch in mourning. And if nothing else, they provided stories, ones that made their way into letters, journals, and drawing room gossip. Tales of a kangaroo getting loose in the gardens, or a parrot that swore in 3 languages. Or yes, a wombat that might or might not have chewed on someone's petticoat. But while the wombat became a footnote, another animal, lace, became fashion's headline. Because the next royal moment wasn't about beasts. It was about a wedding dress, and it changed everything. 47. The lace that launched 1,000 brides. On February 10, 1840, Queen Victoria walked down the aisle to marry Prince Albert wearing a white dress, a bold fashion choice at the time. But more than the color, it was the lace that made history. Honiton lace, to be exact. Handmade, painstakingly delicate, and deeply unfashionable by the late 1830s, Honiton lace had been a major industry in Devon, but was in decline. Victoria, in her quietly strategic way, chose it not just for its beauty, but to revive British craftsmanship. She didn't just wear a dress. She wore a message. This monarchy supports its people, one stitch at a time. The gown itself was a triumph of simplicity and symbolism. No royal red or gold, no brocade, just creamy silk satin with flounces of Honiton lace, adorned with orange blossoms, symbols of purity and fertility. Her veil, also Honiton, was anchored with a simple wreath. The entire ensemble was romantic, modest, and radically different from the jewel-studded, corseted spectacles of previous royal brides. The public took notice. The press described the gown in gushing detail. Illustrated magazines etched its contours for readers to pore over at breakfast. Lace orders surged. Suddenly, Honiton workshops were back in demand. Young brides all over the country, then the empire, began copying the look. A white wedding dress, once unusual, became the gold standard. Victoria didn't intend to set a trend, at least not in the way modern influencers do. But her choice had ripple effects across fashion, economy, and social ritual. The white lace wedding became aspirational, even for women who had nothing in common with the Queen except the dream of romance and permanence. Every generation since has borrowed the look in some way. Princesses, commoners, film stars. Even brides today, clutching Pinterest boards, owe something to that quiet revolution of lace and understatement. The dress is now preserved at Kensington Palace. It looks fragile, humble, almost forgettable. Until you realize it invented an entire cultural script, one that says, "This is how you dress for forever." But Victoria's influence wasn't just sewn into dresses, it was stamped onto everything, quite literally. Because the monarchy soon discovered something else it could monetize, itself. 48. Souvenir. Mania Victorian. Britain didn't invent merchandise, but it perfected it, and no institution was more enthusiastically commodified than the monarchy. Royal births, weddings, jubilees, and funerals weren't just occasions. They were product launches. From printed fans and decorative plates to biscuit tins, brooches, mugs, jigsaw puzzles, commemorative coins, and tea towels, no event passed without being turned into something you could hold, collect, or drink tea out of. If Queen Victoria sneezed in public, someone would sell a porcelain replica of the handkerchief within a fortnight. The 1887 Golden Jubilee took souvenir mania into overdrive. Factories churned out items at an industrial pace. Entire neighborhoods were decorated in red, white, and blue bunting, while shop windows became altars to the Queen's face. It was national devotion meets consumer capitalism, and it worked. Even the lower classes, excluded from the banquets and pageantry, could participate by buying a commemorative plate or spoon. These weren't throwaway trinkets either. Many were made to last. You can still find them today in antique shops and attics, their colors faded but intact. The Queen's profile stamped into tin, ironstone, and porcelain with proud permanence. It wasn't just about celebration. It was reassurance. In a world of rapid industrial change, expanding cities, and political unease, these souvenirs offered something stable, familiar, royalty in your kitchen cupboard, tradition on your mantelpiece. Queen Victoria herself was aware of the phenomenon and, to a point, amused by it. She understood the power of her image, and unlike her predecessors, she didn't fear being seen. In fact, she encouraged it through photographs, portraits, processions, and yes, tea mugs. The monarchy had become a brand, and its primary product? Itself. Next came the walk, the ritualized royal stroll through gardens and crowds, a choreography of presence meant to remind the people that the Queen was not just a figure on a stamp, but a living presence behind the glass. 49. The Royal Walk. As spectacle. Long before paparazzi, before flashbulbs and tabloid headlines, there was the walk. Not a normal walk. Not a stroll for one's health or a meander through a private garden. No, this was the royal walk. A slow, deliberate, theatrically composed act of visibility that Queen Victoria helped codify into ritual. It wasn't just a show of mobility. It was a message. During the early years of her reign, Victoria's public appearances were infrequent but powerful. Crowds gathered to catch a glimpse of her riding in carriages through London, peering through veils and fog, clutching handkerchiefs as though a passing glance might change the course of their week. But after Prince Albert's death, her withdrawal from public life created both mystery and unease. The nation, increasingly anxious, missed its queen. Eventually, she returned, not fully, not joyfully, but deliberately. And with that return came the walk. At Balmoral, at Windsor, even at Osborne, Victoria's walks became staged events, carefully timed, gently choreographed, subtly monitored by staff and security. And yet, to the public, they appeared almost casual. The Queen would appear, often flanked by one or two attendants, and walk slowly through the gardens or along designated paths. Occasionally she would stop and acknowledge onlookers with a slight nod or a wave. Sometimes she'd greet children. Rarely she would speak. But always she would be seen. This visibility was political. It reassured the public that their queen still existed, not just in newspapers or on coins, but in real flesh and blood presence. It reinforced the image of monarchy as a living symbol, bound to tradition, but moving forward, one small, heavily guarded step at a time. The walk also became a form of controlled intimacy. For subjects who would never be invited to court, never attend a levee or garden party, seeing the Queen from 10 paces away became a story to pass down. "I saw her with my own eyes," they'd say. "She waved at me." It was monarchy as living theater, but with no speaking roles for anyone but the lead. The concept evolved over the decades. What began as Victoria's garden promenade transformed into the balcony wave at Buckingham Palace, the carriage rides during jubilees, the public appearances that modern royals still perform today. These rituals are scripted, silent, yet potent. The crowd cheers. The royal nods. Nothing is said, and everything is communicated. Victoria's personal walks were sometimes tinged with melancholy. Even when surrounded by attendants, she often seemed solitary. Walking, for her, was not exercise. It was memory. At Balmoral, every path reminded her of Albert. Every turn held a shadow. And yet she walked them. Again and again. To the public, these walks seemed almost saintly. The Queen in her black dress, moving like a statue that had learned to breathe. In her mourning veil, she looked less like a sovereign and more like a relic, still somehow walking forward while everything around her changed. And the media, of course, took notice. These appearances were reported with near religious reverence. The Queen appeared on the terrace, one article noted, and the crowd, subdued by her presence, parted silently. That silence wasn't emptiness, it was awe, the kind that only royalty could conjure by simply existing. The walk was power without speaking. rule without decree, presence without touch. But the royal stage wasn't limited to solitary walks. It also extended to the next generation, the debutantes and duchesses and terrified daughters of baronets, all preparing for their moment in front of the queen. Because before one could walk through society, one had to curtsy. Perfectly. Publicly. And in a dress that weighed more than some dogs. 50. Court presentation. Choreographies. There are many ways to feel like your spine is about to give out, but few are as exquisitely designed to achieve this as the Victorian debutante curtsy. Each spring, under the glittering chandeliers of royal residences, dozens of young women stood poised in absurdly heavy gowns, balancing plumed headdresses, and rehearsing a gesture that, if executed poorly, could result in career-ending social humiliation, the court curtsy. To be presented at court was the pinnacle of upper-class coming of age. It signaled that a young woman was now officially part of society, ready to attend balls, eligible for marriage, and likely to receive a dozen unsolicited offers from minor aristocrats with failing estates. But before any of that could happen, one had to pass the test of presentation. This wasn't just a matter of showing up in your best tiara. No. Court presentation was a full-blown ceremony of etiquette and precision. The curtsy had to be deep but not theatrical, graceful but not flirtatious, steady but deferential. You lowered yourself, slowly, while maintaining eye contact, not falling over, and keeping your plume from stabbing the person behind you. If you wobbled, tripped, or looked unsure, you might end up as the cautionary tale of the season. Mothers hired tutors specifically for curtsy training. Some debutantes practiced with bowls on their heads. Others rehearsed with footmen timing their descent. There were rumors of girls fainting mid-bend or stepping on their own trains with disastrous consequences. Court presentation was not a charming ritual. It was a gladiatorial sport in tulle and taffeta. Queen Victoria, seated like an immovable oracle, observed each young woman with a gaze that could turn blood cold. She rarely commented, but her silence spoke volumes. A small nod meant success. A glance away meant forgettable. And heaven help the poor soul who was too short, too flashy, or too nervous to make an impression. But those who passed were rewarded with bragging rights that lasted a lifetime. "I was presented to the Queen," they'd whisper decades later, as if they'd survived some sacred trial. Because in many ways, they had. The court presentation wasn't just about entering society, it was about surviving monarchy's most delicate performance. It was where velvet met judgment, and where an entire social class reaffirmed itself through awkward rituals and perfectly timed bows. Yet while most young women dreamed of impressing the Queen, one name lingered in the shadows. Not for her social debut, but for something far darker. A theory. A rumor. A scandalous whisper that never truly died. It involved a prince, a mystery, and the blood-stained fog of Whitechapel. 51. Legend of the Ripper Prince, firmly debunked. Among all the myths that swirl around the Victorian era, haunted castles, secret marriages, occult-loving duchesses, perhaps none is as stubbornly seductive as the theory that Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, was in fact Jack the Ripper. Let's get this out of the way. He wasn't. But the rumor endures. Albert Victor, known to the family as Eddie, was the eldest son of the future Edward VII and second in line to the throne. He was mild-mannered, not particularly bright, socially awkward, and largely kept out of the political spotlight. He had a delicate constitution, a reputation for being led by stronger personalities, and a public image that was more ceremonial than substantial. In short, not an obvious candidate for one of history's most infamous serial killers. But in the decades following the Whitechapel murders of 1888, as theories proliferated and conspiracies flourished, Eddie's name surfaced, first quietly, then loudly, then absurdly. Some claimed he had a mental breakdown, Others alleged he fathered a secret child with a prostitute, triggering a cover-up. Still others wove elaborate tales involving Freemasons, royal physicians, and Queen Victoria herself orchestrating a web of silence. None of it was true. During the timeline of the murders, Prince Eddie's whereabouts were documented with frustrating clarity. He was in Balmoral, then in Yorkshire, then attending royal functions far from the East End. Every reputable historian has dismissed the theory, but the public, ever hungry for scandal, kept chewing on it. Why? Because it's irresistible. The idea of a royal gone rogue, of Buckingham Palace hiding a monster, it's Victorian Gothic at its juiciest. Never mind the facts. The fog, the gaslight, the cobblestones, they set the stage too perfectly. A faceless killer, a troubled prince, a monarchy teetering on the edge of modernity. It was never about truth. It was about narrative. Albert Victor died young, in 1892, of pneumonia. His death devastated the royal family and changed the line of succession. But to conspiracy theorists, it offered the perfect ending. A conveniently timed demise, closing the case with a whisper of royal scandal. Today, historians roll their eyes at the theory, but it hasn't vanished. Books, films, docuseries, they all circle back to the prince who wasn't. Because in Victorian Britain, even the most ordinary royal could become a legend, especially if no one ever really knew what to make of him. And speaking of unknowable royals, let's turn to the names behind the diamonds and titles. Not the formal ones, but the pet names. The cozy, peculiar, slightly ridiculous nicknames the royal family used behind palace doors. 52. Royal nicknames galore. We imagine royalty as formal, stiff, and ceremonial, cloaked in titles, armed with scepters, weighed down by history and diamonds. But behind the velvet curtains and beneath all the pageantry, Queen Victoria's family did what every family does when the doors are shut and the servants are, mostly, out of earshot. They called each other ridiculous names. Victoria, matriarch of the empire, Empress of India, and the very model of Victorian sobriety, was, to her children, simply Mama. But the more interesting titles began to appear in letters and private diaries. Prince Albert, the beloved and uber-organized consort, was often Papa, but Victoria also called him my angel or darling Albert, sometimes embarrassingly so. Her private letters to him read like a schoolgirl's diary crossed with a German-language grammar guide. But even in public-facing letters, the affection bled through. Victoria was many things, but emotionally reserved with her inner circle was not one of them. The children, meanwhile, developed a complex web of nicknames that make the family sound less like royalty and more like characters in a particularly chaotic nursery. Albert Edward, Bertie to everyone, would eventually become King Edward VII. But he was rarely called anything so dignified in the family circle. His sisters sometimes called him Fat Bertie in their letters, not kindly but not cruelly either. It was a familial jab, the kind only siblings can get away with when you're all stuck in lace collars and being forced to eat boiled meats in unison. Victoria, the eldest daughter, was Vicky, and her daughter, Victoria's granddaughter, was also nicknamed Moretta, because apparently one Victoria per generation was simply not enough. Helena became Lenchen, a German diminutive that sounds more like a fairy tale sprite than a daughter of the sovereign. Louise was Lucy, or Lulu, depending on which sibling was writing. Beatrice, the youngest and most doted on, was Baby, and the name stuck well into her adult years, long after it became an ironic understatement. Affection was baked into the titles. Nicknames softened the monarchy. They humanized the family behind the facade of ceremony. Letters exchanged between the children are full of these nicknames, often side by side with formal concerns about health, marriage, or royal duties. One moment you'd read Lenchen is terribly cross with Lulu, and the next, a discussion about court protocol or a bishop's scandal. Even among the grandchildren, the tradition continued. George V was Georgie, and Prince Eddie, the doomed Duke of Clarence, was Eddie to family and friends, his full name being far too grandiose for casual use. Everyone had a pocket-sized identity within the family, tucked behind their parade uniform and state title. It wasn't just endearing, it was strategic. Nicknames helped distinguish between the dozens of royals named Victoria, Albert, Edward, or George. The royal naming tradition had a tendency to recycle its greatest hits, and without nicknames, you'd need a family tree just to get through tea. But they also served as a kind of emotional shorthand. In a family that spent so much time under scrutiny, with their lives plotted like chess moves, a nickname was a small sanctuary, a way of saying, I know you, not as the Duke, not as the Princess, just as you. The royal archives are full of these tiny names, scribbled in margins, etched into cards, whispered down corridors. They don't make the history books, but they shape the history. And perhaps none more so than Victoria's own moniker from one particularly trusted servant, Wifey, a name that didn't come from her husband or from a courtier, but from a man who called her that with zero irony and maximum Highland charm. Which brings us to the final mystery, the quietest contradiction of all. A woman of duty, diamonds, and empire, who wanted nothing more than buttered buns and a dog by her side. 53. A queen who loved simple picnics. After decades of reign, a sea of responsibilities, and more titles than anyone knew what to do with, Queen Victoria was, at her core, someone who deeply and sincerely loved a good picnic. Not the elaborate kind with crystal decanters and 5-foot floral arrangements, although those existed too, carefully arranged by staff for formal portraits. No, Victoria's favorite picnics were the modest ones. The ones at Balmoral, far from London's smoke, where the air smelled of pine and heather, and the view rolled out like a watercolor. She would rise early, don her black dress, and summon a small retinue, just enough to carry baskets and make tea. Then she'd head to one of her favorite spots, a quiet glen, a hilltop clearing, or the banks of the River Dee. There, seated on a tartan blanket, she would drink from a tin cup, nibble buttered bread, and take in the rare pleasure of silence. Her dogs would roam. A trusted servant, often John Brown, later Abdul Karim, would sit nearby. No fanfare, no speeches, just a woman and her sandwich. For Victoria, these moments were more than rustic outings. They were escape routes. Balmoral was her emotional refuge, a place she associated with love, grief, and unfiltered time. It was where Albert had smiled most easily, where she had cried most freely, where she could drop, if not the crown, then at least the posture that came with it. The picnics became part of her routine, a small, stable act in a life otherwise governed by change. When she wrote about them in her journals, her tone softened. There was a warmth, even playfulness. She delighted in simple things, the weather being just right, the buns being warm, the butter not melting too fast. Sometimes she sketched the view, sometimes she just sat. It's tempting to think of Victoria as permanently stern, the granite-faced widow, the towering symbol of empire. But the truth is stranger and more moving. This was a woman who signed laws, survived assassination attempts, and made decisions that changed the world, and who also worried whether the kettle had boiled properly by the time the tea was poured. Staff remembered these moments vividly. They spoke of the Queen's fondness for simplicity, for being outdoors, for not talking unless necessary. Her dogs were often the only ones allowed to interrupt. There are diary entries detailing the name of every canine companion who attended these outings, as though they were foreign dignitaries. Victoria's picnics were not about performance. They were about pause. In the long, carefully choreographed play that was her life, they were the unscripted scenes, moments not of rule, but of being. And perhaps that's the greatest mystery of all, that the most powerful woman in the world found peace not in palaces, but on a tartan rug, beside a stream, with a slice of cake in her lap, and a dog asleep at her feet. No crown, no crowd, just a little quiet. And that, more than any statue, any empire, or any jubilee, might be the most lasting image of Queen Victoria. Not the monarch, not the matriarch, just Victoria. In the end, it was never about being amused. It was about being.